Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the morning of June 10th, 1991. Imagine, if you will, the cool, thinning air of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The town of Mayors, California, sits nestled just south of Lake Tahoe, surrounded by a cathedral of towering pines and the scent of damp earth and evergreen needles. On this particular Monday morning, the sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged peaks, casting long, amber fingers across the quiet streets. The world felt fresh and safe. It was the kind of morning where the only sound should have been the chirping of mountain chickadees and the gentle rustle of wind through the branches. But in the shadows of Washoe Way, a story was about to begin that would haunt the collective memory of this peaceful community for nearly 2 decades. Breathe in that cold mountain air. Feel the stillness of the neighborhood. Everything is calm. Everything is as it should be until the silence is broken by the low hum of an approaching engine. Inside a modest home, 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard was preparing for her day. She was a child of light and favorite colors, and today, that color was pink. She moved through the house with the soft steps of a young girl who knew the rhythms of her family. She checked on her baby sister, Shayna, who was only 19 months old, watching the soft rise and fall of the toddler's chest as she slept. Jaycee looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her clothes. She was wearing a pink windbreaker over a pink shirt, and her hair was held back by a bright pink ribbon. On her finger, she wore a silver ring shaped like a butterfly, a small treasure that felt like a part of her soul. She could hear the muffled sounds of her stepfather, Carl Probin, working in the garage, the clinking of tools against metal, the familiar domestic symphony of a morning routine. She said her goodbyes, her voice light and hopeful, and stepped out into the bright, crisp air. The walk to the school bus stop was short, just a few hundred yards up a gentle hill, a path she had walked many times before without a single thought of fear. As Jaycee walked, her sneakers made a soft, rhythmic crunching sound on the gravel at the edge of the asphalt. She walked against the traffic, as she had been taught, watching the few cars that passed by in the early morning light. The mountain sun was warming the back of her neck, and the shadows of the pines danced across the road like shifting ink blots. She reached the area of the bus stop, her mind likely filled with thoughts of her upcoming school field trip and the simple joys of the 5th grade. The air was so quiet here that she could hear the distant drone of a motor long before she saw the vehicle. It was a dull, mid-sized sedan, a shade of gray that seemed to blend into the morning mist. It looked unremarkable, just another car navigating the winding mountain roads. But as it drew closer, its pace began to change. It slowed down, the tires whispering against the pavement, drawing a line toward the young girl in the pink windbreaker. Jaycee stopped. She thought perhaps the driver was lost, looking for directions in this labyrinth of mountain lanes. She turned her face toward the car, her expression open and helpful, unaware that the predator had already locked his gaze upon her. From the driveway of their home, Carl Probin looked up. He was a carpet contractor, a man used to the weight of hard work, and in that moment, he saw something that made the hair on his arms stand up. He saw the gray car make a sharp, sudden U-turn at the bus stop. It was a violent movement that broke the peaceful flow of the morning. In an instant, the car doors flew open. A man leaped out, his movements jagged and frantic. Before Jaycee could even register a sense of danger, a sharp, crackling sound tore through the air. The man held a stun gun, and the electric blue spark was the last thing Jaycee saw before the world dissolved into a blur of pain and confusion. A woman emerged from the car as well, reaching out to help pull the small, limp body of the 11-year-old girl into the back seat. It happened with a terrifying efficiency, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality that lasted only seconds. Carl shouted, his voice echoing fruitlessly against the wall of trees. He felt a surge of adrenaline so hot it burned his throat. He looked around wildly and grabbed the only thing he could find, a mountain bike leaning against the garage wall. The chase was a desperate, lopsided battle. Carl pedaled with everything he had, his lungs screaming as he tried to pull oxygen from the thin mountain air. He watched the gray sedan pull away, its tires throwing up a small cloud of dust and gravel as it accelerated down the winding road. He could see the back of the car, the glint of the sunlight on the rear window, and he knew that Jaycee was inside, hidden behind the cold glass. He pedaled until his legs felt like lead, until the car became a small speck in the distance and eventually vanished around a bend. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like a physical weight on his chest. He stood in the middle of the road, gasping for air, the mountain bike lying discarded in the dirt. He was alone. The street was empty. The gray car was gone, and with it, the sunshine of their lives had been stolen in broad daylight. He turned and ran back to the house, his mind a chaotic storm of panic and disbelief, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a drum of war. When the police arrived minutes later, the scene was eerily still. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had a quarter of an hour before, but everything had changed. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle to the untrained eye. But there, on the rough black asphalt of the road, lying near the spot where the gray car had made its predatory turn, was a small, vibrant splash of color. It was Jaycee's pink ribbon. It lay flat against the ground, the fabric slightly frayed, looking small and fragile against the vastness of the mountain landscape. It was a silent witness to the vanishing of a child. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the silver needles of the pines, the ribbon remained, a haunting marker of the exact second a life was diverted into the darkness. The search would soon involve hundreds of people, dogs, and helicopters, but for now, there was only that ribbon, fluttering slightly in the breeze. The investigation was just beginning, a journey that would span 18 long, agonizing years. But for tonight, we stay here in the quiet of that June morning looking at the pink ribbon on the asphalt. Close your eyes. Let the mountain air cool your mind. The story continues, but for now, you are safe in the stillness. The silence that followed the screech of tires was not a true silence. It was a heavy, vibrating pressure that seemed to push against the eardrums of everyone on Washon Boulevard. Within minutes, the mountain air, usually scented with the sharp, clean tang of ponderosa pine and damp earth, was choked by the acrid smell of exhaust and the frantic energy of first responders. The arrival of the authorities transformed the sleepy neighborhood into a chaotic hive of activity. Blue and red lights sliced through the morning shadows of the tall trees, casting long, rhythmic flickers against the wood-shingled houses that lined the street. You could hear the crackle of police radios, a jagged, metallic sound that cut through the soft rustle of the Sierra Nevada breeze. Officers moved with a hurried gravity, their heavy boots thudding against the rough asphalt as they paced. Their eyes were scanning the ground for any scuff mark, any stray thread, or any small clue that could point toward the two-toned gray sedan that had vanished into the labyrinth of mountain roads. The pavement was still warm from the morning sun, but the atmosphere had turned cold, a sudden winter of the soul that descended upon the small community of South Lake Tahoe on that Monday, June 10th, 1991. As the sun climbed higher over the jagged, granite peaks of the Sierras, the investigation turned inward, its gaze sharpening on the people closest to the girl. Carl Probin found himself at the center of a storm he could not control. The air in the interrogation room was stagnant, tasting of stale coffee and the cold, metallic tang of deep-seated fear. He sat under the harsh, humming glow of fluorescent lights that made every shadow look like a confession. The investigators were methodical, their voices kept low and repetitive, circling the same questions like hawks over a quiet valley. They watched the twitch of his hands, the sweat on his brow, and the way his breath caught in his parched throat. The polygraph machine sat on the wooden table between them, a silent arbiter of truth with its long, delicate needles poised over rolls of moving paper. He could feel the physical scratch of those needles in his mind, tracing the jagged mountain range of his own panic as they recorded his heart rate and breathing. Even as he passed the tests, one after another, the weight of suspicion remained a physical presence in the room. It was a thick, suffocating layer of dust that settled over his marriage and his entire life, creating a rift that no amount of proof could ever truly bridge. Outside, the town began to wrap itself in a collective mourning that was still tinged with a desperate, fragile hope. Everywhere you looked, there was pink. Terry Probin had chosen the color because it was Jaycee's favorite, and now, thousands of yards of silk and nylon ribbon fluttered from the rough bark of pine trees and the silver antennas of parked cars. The ribbons danced in the alpine wind, a silent, flickering language of grief that could be seen from the edges of the lake to the high mountain passes. In the local shops, the smell of fresh ink from thousands of missing person flyers hung heavy in the air. Jaycee's face, frozen in an 11-year-old's innocent smile, stared back from every glass window and every telephone pole. The community felt smaller now, the vast wilderness of the surrounding forest no longer a playground, but a dark, impenetrable wall of secrets. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter as they walked through the grocery store, their eyes darting toward every passing car, searching for a flash of gray metal or a face that did not belong in their quiet world. The sound of children playing in the streets was replaced by the low, anxious murmurs of adults standing on their porches, watching the shadows grow longer as evening approached. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived like a sudden, cold front, bringing 30 agents who swarmed over Echo Summit with a clinical and daunting intensity. They set up a task force in a room filled with the constant hum of computers and the frantic scratching of pens on oversized maps. They pinned red markers across the topography of the Sierras, charting every possible route the kidnappers might have taken. Leads poured in by the thousands, alleged sightings in lonely truck stops, blurry figures seen in the back of moving vans, and whispers from the rough edges of the state. Each tip was a spark of hope that the agents tried to fan into a flame, only to watch it flicker and die in the damp mountain air. They canvassed the neighborhoods again and again, their questions echoing off the canyon walls as they knocked on every door within miles. But as the days turned into long weeks, the frenetic energy began to ebb. The helicopters that had thrummed overhead, their rotors beating against the sky like a giant, mechanical heart, eventually grew quiet and returned to their hangars. The large, dark vehicles of the federal agents began to pull away, one by one, leaving behind a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise of the search had ever been. Eventually, the media cameras, once packed so tightly on the sidewalk that they blocked the path to the front door, began to disappear. The bright, hot lights were packed away into black cases, and the journalists moved on to the next tragedy in another town. In the house on Washon Boulevard, the silence became absolute and crushing. Jaycee's room remained exactly as she had left it on that Monday morning. The air inside was perfectly still, holding the faint, lingering scent of laundry detergent and the sweetness of a child's perfume. The bedsheets were pulled tight, the pillows plumped and waiting for a girl who did not return when the streetlights flickered on. Terry and Carl moved through the rooms like ghosts, their voices falling into a hollow rhythm of shared sorrow that eventually began to fray and snap under the pressure of the unknown. The gap where Jaycee had been grew wider with every passing sunset, a hollow space that could not be filled by ribbons, prayers, or the passing of the seasons. The investigation, once a roaring fire of activity, had slowed to a smolder, and then to a cold, gray ash. The trail, once warm with the hope of a quick recovery, had gone completely cold, buried under the weight of 18 long years of unanswered questions and the shifting needles of the pine trees. The transition from the ordinary to the unthinkable was marked by a single, unremarkable wooden fence at 1554 Walnut Avenue. To a casual passerby in the quiet suburb of Antioch, California, the house appeared like any other, perhaps a bit weathered, with a lawn that had seen better days and a porch where shadows gathered in the heat of the afternoon. But behind that initial barrier lay a labyrinth of secrets, a second backyard hidden entirely within the first. As you step mentally into that space, the air feels different. It is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of old tarps. The lush, overgrown canopy of trees creates a ceiling of emerald and gray, filtering the sunlight into jagged, dancing patterns on the dirt. There is no rhythmic hum of a neighborhood here, only the suffocating stillness of a world designed to be forgotten. The ground is uneven, cluttered with the debris of a life lived in the margins, where every footstep on the dry leaves sounds like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. Deep within this tangled garden, the structures of captivity emerge from the shadows like ghosts. There are sheds made of rough-hewn timber and tents with sides that have grown thin and brittle under the relentless California sun. One particular shed stands as a silent sentinel of the early years. Its walls were reinforced, soundproofed with thick material to ensure that no cry for help would ever drift over the fence line to the neighbors, who were only a few dozen feet away. Imagine the texture of the cool, dark wood against a palm, the silence so absolute that the only sound is the frantic beating of one's own heart. Above, the blue tarps that once shielded the compound from the eyes of satellite cameras flap rhythmically in the breeze, a dry, plastic snapping sound that echoes through the trees. These tarps faded to a dull, dusty azure, were the sky for those living below. They created a canopy of artificial twilight, a world where the horizon was limited to the reach of a frayed rope and the edge of a weathered canvas. The reality of this makeshift compound was a jarring mixture of domesticity and squalor. In one corner, a rudimentary shower and an outhouse stood as cold reminders of the lack of basic comforts. Electrical cords, like long, black serpents, slithered across the dirt, snaking their way from the main house to the sheds to provide a flicker of light or the hum of a small television. It was through that glowing screen that the world outside was filtered, a world of colors and voices that felt as distant as the stars. Yet, even in this wasteland, there were signs of a defiant spirit. A small patch of garden where flowers were meticulously tended, their petals vibrant against the gray backdrop of the shacks. A child's tricycle, its metal frame slightly rusted from the morning dew, sat near a cluster of plastic storage bins that held the meager belongings of a family hidden in plain sight. The smell of wood smoke would sometimes drift through the air, mingling with the sweet, heavy fragrance of blooming jasmine, a sensory contradiction that defined the long, drifting years of 1991 through 2009. But the strongest walls in the hidden garden were not made of wood or canvas. They were built of fear and carefully crafted lies. The physical boundaries were reinforced by the psychological chains forged by Philip and Nancy. In the early days, the threat of Doberman pinschers prowling the perimeter kept the world small and the spirit contained. Then came the change of identity, a slow erosion of the self, as the name Jaycee was traded for the name Alyssa. Within the confines of the fences, a distorted family tree took root. Two young girls, born into this secret world, were taught to call their own mother their sister, while Nancy assumed the role of the matriarch. This web of deception was woven so tightly that the lines between captor and family began to blur like ink in the rain. Every day was a lesson in submission, a quiet navigation of Philip's volatile moods, and his long, rambling lectures that filled the air of the compound with a heavy, confusing energy. The girls grew up in the shadows of the eucalyptus trees, their laughter muffled by the soundproofing, their entire existence a secret kept by a man who walked the streets as a registered offender, while a kingdom of shadows thrived in his own backyard. As the seasons turned over 18 long years, the compound became a static universe. The neighbors on the other side of the fence lived lives of grocery lists and lawn maintenance, never knowing that just a few yards away, a young woman was homeschooling 2 children in a tent. Sometimes, the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower would buzz in the distance, a reminder of a reality that was so close, yet utterly unreachable. The psychological perimeter was so effective that even when the gates were not physically locked, the internal gates remained shut. The outside world was painted as a place of danger, while the hidden garden, for all its cruelty, was the only home the children had ever known. They lived in a state of hypervigilance, learning to read the shifting winds of the household, finding moments of peace in the pages of a book or the quiet growth of a seedling. The hidden garden was a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the days were identical, and the nights were filled with the rustle of the wind against the tarps, a constant, whispering reminder of the world that had forgotten to look behind the fence. The seasons in Antioch did not arrive with a fanfare of color or a sudden shift in the wind. Instead, they seeped into the backyard through the thick canopy of mimosa and locust trees, changing the quality of the shadows that fell across the blue tarps. Time, which had once been measured by the ringing of school bells and the rhythm of a kitchen clock, slowed to a crawl. It became a heavy, tangible thing, like the damp, loamy earth that clung to the soles of old shoes. Within the high, 6-foot fences, a secondary universe had formed, a pocket of existence that the rest of the world could not see. The air here often smelled of wet wood and the faint, sweet decay of fallen fruit, mixed with the metallic tang of the rusted tools scattered near the sheds. For Jaycee, the early years of her captivity were a blur of isolation, but the stillness was about to be broken by a profound and terrifying responsibility. As the year 1994 approached, the small, soundproofed shed became more than just a prison. It became a nursery. At the age of 14, while most girls her age were navigating the hallways of junior high and the first stirrings of independence, Jaycee was preparing to bring a life into the world. There were no doctors, no soft hospital lights, and no comforting voices of family members. There was only the silence of the backyard and the cold, unyielding reality of her situation. On the 18th of August, 1994, the first child was born. In the quiet of a tent, with only the most rudimentary materials and videos to guide her, Jaycee became a mother. When she first looked at the tiny, fragile infant she named Angel, something shifted deep within her. The baby was a miracle of softness in a world made of rough plywood and industrial plastic. In that moment, Jaycee felt a fierce, protective love that she had never known. She later described the feeling as no longer being alone. For the first time in years, she had someone who belonged to her, someone she could hold and whisper to in the dark of the shed. The frequency of the assaults from her captor began to slow, though they never truly ceased. His attention turned toward the strange, dark fantasy of a family he was building in the shadows of his property. 3 years later, in November of 1997, a second daughter arrived. She was named Starlight. Now, the small compound was home to 3, and the dynamics of survival became even more complex. Jaycee was only 17 years old, yet she was the sole protector and provider of warmth for 2 young lives. She looked into their eyes and saw reflections of her own lost childhood, and she knew that for their sake, she could never let her spirit break entirely. She would build a world for them, out of whatever scraps of normalcy she could find. Life in the backyard was a study in the mundane and the bizarre. To the girls, the series of tents and dilapidated sheds were not a prison, but their entire world. They grew up surrounded by a landscape of detritus and hidden beauty. There was a fish tank that sat on a shelf, its water eventually turning a deep, murky green with algae, yet it represented a small piece of the living world. There were stacks of paperback books with titles like Self-Esteem, A Family Affair, and a small Aladdin-themed ironing board that sat amidst the clutter. Jaycee did her best to create a routine that mirrored the life she barely remembered. She became their teacher, their playmate, and their shield. Having only completed the 5th grade herself before she was taken, she used every ounce of knowledge she possessed to homeschool her daughters. They sat together on old rugs, the air heavy with the scent of mold and the hum of a distant refrigerator, and practiced reading and math. She told them stories of the world beyond the fence, though she had to be careful. A cruel deception had been woven into their upbringing. To keep the peace and satisfy the warped demands of their captors, the girls were raised to believe that Nancy was their mother and that Jaycee was merely their older sister. It was a heartbreaking lie, a price paid for the relative safety of the children. Jaycee watched them play with a tricycle and a swing set that had been placed in the dirt, their laughter a strange, high-pitched sound that occasionally drifted over the fence to neighbors who never suspected the truth. The girls, Angel and Starlight, were remarkably resilient, their innocence preserved by the wall of love Jaycee built around them. They saw the sky through the gaps in the locust trees and felt the heat of the California summers against the nylon walls of their tents. In the winter, the cold would settle into their bones, and they would huddle together under piles of mismatched blankets, listening to the rain drum against the tarps. Jaycee found solace in a small garden she tended, planting flowers that brought bursts of vibrant color to the gray and brown corners of the yard. Digging her fingers into the soil was a way to ground herself, a way to feel connected to the earth when her life felt so disconnected from humanity. Philip would often launch into enraged rants or long, nonsensical lectures, and Jaycee would do everything in her power to distract the girls, to pull them away from his volatility. She worked to keep their minds active and their hearts light, even as the years stretched into a decade, and then more. They were the Shadow family, existing just a few yards away from the ordinary lives of people who were mowing their lawns and washing their cars. The proximity to the normal world was a constant, dull ache. Jaycee could hear the sounds of the neighborhood, the barking of dogs, and the distant hum of traffic on the highway, yet she and her daughters remained invisible, ghosts in a suburban backyard. As the girls grew, they became more aware of the oddity of their existence, yet it was the only reality they had ever known. They were healthy and intelligent, a testament to the sheer force of will Jaycee exerted every single day. She acted as a graphic artist in the print shop Philip operated, her skills developing out of necessity and a desire to contribute something tangible to the world. She would talk to customers on the phone using an alias, her voice steady and professional, while her daughters waited in the shadows behind her. The complexity of their survival was a delicate dance between compliance and internal resistance. Every day was a triumph of endurance. The passing of 18 years is not just a number. It is thousands of sunrises seen through the same fence, thousands of meals eaten in the same cramped quarters, and a lifetime of missed milestones. Yet, in the middle of that darkness, there was the sound of her daughters breathing as they slept, the touch of their small hands, and the secret, unspoken bond of a mother who had sacrificed everything to keep them whole. The backyard was a place of deep sorrow, but it was also a place where a young girl had grown into a woman of unimaginable strength. She had created a family in the ruins of her own life, a shadow family that would one day emerge into the light, forever changed but undeniably alive. The air on the Berkeley campus that late August afternoon was thick with the scent of sun-warmed eucalyptus and the hum of thousands of students returning for the autumn semester. It was the 24th of August, 2009, a day that began with the ordinary rhythm of academic bureaucracy. Inside the small, cramped office of the Special Events Unit, the light filtered through the windows in dusty beams, illuminating the cluttered desks and the stacks of permits that usually marked the height of the season. Lisa Campbell sat amidst this familiar chaos, her eyes adjusted to the flicker of her computer screen and the steady ticking of a wall clock that seemed to echo in the quiet moments between visitors. The atmosphere was one of typical university business, safe and predictable, until the door creaked open to reveal a trio that looked as though they had been pulled from a different century entirely. There stood a man, gray-haired and vibrating with a strange, manic energy, and beside him were two young girls who seemed to exist in a separate, silent dimension. The man introduced himself as Philip Garrido. He wore a suit that did not quite fit, the fabric hanging off his frame like a borrowed costume, and he spoke with a rapid-fire intensity that immediately made the air in the small room feel thin. He was there to inquire about holding a religious event on campus, something he called God's desire. As he spoke, he gestured wildly with hands that seemed unable to find rest, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an invisible audience. But it was not just his behavior that caught Lisa's attention. It was the two girls standing behind him. They were 15 and 11 years old, yet they stood with a stiff, unnatural posture, their hands clasped firmly in front of their legs. Their skin was a startling shade of pale, almost a translucent gray, as if they had spent their entire lives shielded from the California sun. They wore modest, drab clothing that felt out of place against the vibrant, modern fashion of the students walking just a few feet away outside the window. They were like ghosts, appearing in the middle of a crowded room. Lisa felt a cold prickle of intuition crawl up her spine. She had seen many eccentric characters in her time at the university, but this was different. The silence of the girls was heavy, a physical weight in the office. They did not look at the colorful posters on the walls or the toys left on a side table. They looked only at the floor, or, occasionally, at Philip. The younger girl had eyes of a pale, piercing blue that seemed to hold a depth of sorrow far beyond her years. When Lisa tried to engage them, their responses were robotic, rehearsed, and hollow. They spoke of homeschooling, and their mother in voices that lacked the melodic rise and fall of typical childhood chatter. Barb Mercado, observing the interaction, felt the same sudden shift in the atmosphere. The two women shared a silent, knowing look over the top of a laminate desk. There was a profound wrongness here, a discordance between the man's frantic, self-important rambling and the hollowed-out presence of the children he claimed were his daughters. Garrido continued to talk, his voice rising as he described a pamphlet he had written titled The Origin of Schizophrenia Revealed. He claimed the government was involved in his work, that his event would change the world forever. He reached out and gripped the older girl's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be affectionate but looked more like a claim of ownership. "They are great girls," he said, his voice dropping into a disturbing pride. "They do not even know any curse words." The statement hung in the air, odd and unsettling. Most parents would boast of their children's grades or their talents, not their lack of profanity. Lisa maintained a professional mask, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she asked for his identification. She needed a way to keep him there, to find out who this man truly was. She told him he would need to return the following day to finalize the paperwork, meticulously ensuring that he felt welcomed enough to come back. She watched him walk away, his shadow long and jagged against the concrete path, the two pale girls following him like shadows of a shadow. As soon as the door clicked shut, the silence in the office was broken by the frantic tapping of keys. Barb and Lisa moved with a shared sense of urgency, the intuition of years of service guiding their hands. They ran the name Philip Garrido through the database, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in their wide eyes. When the results flickered onto the screen, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender, a man on federal parole for a kidnapping and rape that had occurred decades ago. The records showed he was supposed to be living in Antioch with his wife and elderly mother. There was no mention of children. The realization hit like a physical blow. Those girls, with their gray skin and their silent, staring eyes, were not supposed to exist. The officers knew then that they weren't just looking at a strange man with a religious obsession. They were looking at the crack in a door that had been locked for 18 long years. With trembling hands, a phone call was placed to Philip's parole officer. The office was quiet now, the ticking clock sounding like a heartbeat in the stillness. When the parole officer answered, the confusion on the other end of the line was immediate. He confirmed that Garrido was childless. He had no daughters. He had no permission to be on a university campus. The web of lies that had held Jaycee and her children captive in the hidden backyard was finally beginning to unravel, caught on the sharp edges of a mother's instinct and a police officer's diligence. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the Berkeley Hills in a deep, bruised purple, the machinery of justice began to turn with a slow, grinding inevitability. The visitor at the gate had walked into the light, unaware that the shadows he had lived in for nearly 2 decades were about to be stripped away forever. The paperwork sat on the desk. A silent witness to the moment the world began to find its way back to the girl who had been lost for so long. The air inside the Concord parole office on that Wednesday in late August, 2009, was thick with a stillness that felt brittle, like thin glass ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. Outside, the California sun beat down on the pavement, but inside, the light was artificial and cold, humming with the low, persistent drone of fluorescent tubes overhead. Philip sat there, his fingers perhaps drumming a nervous, uneven rhythm against the arm of the plastic chair, while Nancy remained at his side, a shadow of a woman whose silence had been her armor for nearly 2 decades. Nearby sat the woman the world knew as Alyssa, though the name felt like a heavy, ill-fitting cloak she had been forced to wear for 18 years. Beside her were the 2 girls, aged 11 and 15, their eyes wide and curious, taking in the sterile environment of beige walls and stacks of manila folders. There was a scent of floor wax and old coffee hanging in the air, a mundane smell that contrasted sharply with the monumental shift that was about to occur. The parole officer, Edward Santos, Jr., moved with a deliberate, professional slowness, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished linoleum as he prepared to pull back the curtain on a secret that had been buried in a backyard for 6,643 days. In a small, windowless interview room, the separation began. It was a tactical move, a quiet peeling away of the layers of control that Philip had meticulously constructed. When the door clicked shut, isolating the woman known as Alyssa from her captor, the very atmosphere seemed to shift. For years, she had lived under the constant, suffocating weight of a threat, the sound of a stun gun's spark, the terrifying promise of pain if she ever dared to speak her truth. But in that room, the authority of the law stood between her and the man who had stolen her childhood. The officer's voice was calm, a steady anchor in a sea of rising emotion. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and asked the questions that had gone unasked for a lifetime. Slowly, the mask began to crumble. The decades of forced identities and whispered lies felt suddenly fragile. With a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 18 years of silence, she finally let the truth emerge. The name she had not been allowed to speak, the name that belonged to the little girl in the pink coat from 1991, was whispered into the quiet of the office. "My name is Jaycee Dugard," she said, and in Inus moment, the invisible chains that had bound her to that backyard in Antioch simply dissolved, leaving only the raw, trembling reality of her own existence. The reunion that followed on the 27th of August was a symphony of sensory restoration. Imagine the soft, muted colors of a private room where Terry Probin waited, her heart likely thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. When Jaycee walked through that door, the world seemed to stop its spinning. There were no cameras, no flashing lights, only the scent of shampoo and the tactile miracle of skin against skin. Terry reached out, her hands shaking as she touched the face of the daughter she had mourned and searched for across 2 decades. The most tender moment was perhaps the simplest. A mother picking up a brush and gently pulling it through her daughter's blonde hair. It was a ritual of care they had last shared when Jaycee was only 11 years old. Each stroke of the bristles was a reclamation of lost time, a quiet declaration that the nightmare was over. They sat together, the silence no longer a weapon used to hide a crime, but a sanctuary where they could begin the slow, arduous process of becoming mother and daughter once again. The girls, who had known Jaycee only as a sister, watched as the titles shifted, the love they had always felt remaining the same even as the truth rearranged their world. Justice arrived in the early summer of 2011, inside a courtroom that smelled of heavy wood and old law books. The air was cool and solemn as the two defendants were led in, draped in the bright, jarring orange of prison jumpsuits. They did not look at the gallery. They kept their heads bowed, as if the weight of their own actions had finally become too heavy to hold upright. Jaycee chose not to be there in person, refusing to grant them even one more second of her physical presence, but her voice filled the room through a statement read by her mother. Her words were sharp and clear, a final reckoning for the years of theft. "I hated every second of every day because of you," the statement declared, echoing against the high ceilings. The judge, Douglas Phimister, spoke with a gravity that matched the crimes, describing the Garridos' actions as a reinvention of slavery. When he delivered the sentence, 431 years to life for Philip and 36 years to life for Nancy, the sound of the gavel striking the wood felt like the closing of a massive, rusted gate. The legal chapter was finished, and the two individuals who had caused so much darkness were escorted away to spend the remainder of their lives in the silence of a cell. Beyond the courtroom and the headlines, a new life began to bloom in the open spaces of Northern California. Jaycee turned her focus toward healing, not just for herself, but for others who had walked through the valley of trauma. She founded the Jaycee Foundation, a name derived from the phrase, "Just ask yourself to care." She found solace in the presence of animals, understanding the unspoken empathy that a horse can offer. Imagine the sound of hooves on soft earth and the rhythmic breathing of a powerful creature as it stands beside a survivor. She spoke of the pinecone, the last thing she had touched before her abduction, as a symbol of hope and new beginnings. It was no longer a marker of the day her life was stolen, but a reminder that even the smallest seed can grow into something resilient and strong. Her journey was not one of simple recovery, but of profound transformation. She moved from the shadows of a hidden backyard into the warm, expansive light of advocacy, teaching the world that while a life can be stolen, the spirit remains an unconquerable thing, capable of finding joy in the simple act of breathing the fresh mountain air. As we look back on this long road home, we see a story that began in terror but ended in an extraordinary testament to human endurance. The details of the backyard, the gray tents, and the sound of the stun gun begin to recede, replaced by the image of a woman standing in the sunlight, surrounded by her family and the quiet beauty of the natural world. The mystery of how she survived is found in the strength she carried within her, a light that never quite went out, even in the deepest dark. We leave her now in that peace, a peace earned through courage and the unwavering love of a mother who never stopped looking. The world outside is quiet now, the shadows are long and soft, and the stories of the day are coming to an end. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.